No, it's here in Washington.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Shoot me an email.
Yeah, here, I'll give you mine as well. We're filtering in.
Yeah. Okay.
Here you go. Take one of those.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay. Oh.
Looks could be deceiving.
No. That is not your case.
Wonderful to see you. Ready for your Thanksgiving?
Don, say hi to Nadia.
I didn't see Nadia.
She's sitting there inconspicuously. Okay, everyone. Или привет.
У тебя были красивые женщины вокруг. Не взял этой ситуации вмешиваться.
Но это ничего, я не буду.
Ты как хочешь, просто я поблагодарил.
Ну, мы, если можем, просто задать какие-то вопросы потом, ладно? Да, я буду просто, да. И как мы, кто здесь должен?
Ты должен сидеть.
Хотя я предпочитаю смотреть на людей. Сейчас. Окей. У нас мы все здесь? Нет. All right. Is everyone here? So, okay. All right. Well, we can start. Yeah. All right. Okay. So since Ilya doesn't want to introduce me, I will introduce him. I will introduce myself. How's that? But Ilya has agreed that afterward he will ask all of the relevant questions because he knows the subject as well as I do. My name is David Satter. I was a Moscow correspondent for those of you who don't know me, and I know a lot of you do. I was Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times, and I've written a number of books about Russia and the Soviet Union. And I was in Russia in 1999 when the apartment bombings took place. And that's what I want to talk about now, because I think there's nothing more, and congratulations to all of you for coming even, because there's nothing more important for U.S.-Russian and Russian-Ukrainian relations than the story of how Putin came to power. Nothing really explains better who he is and is a better indicator of the kind of policies that ought to be pursued in relationship to Russia today. Without this knowledge, and without a lot of other knowledge, Russian disinformation and propaganda has a much clearer path to confusing people's minds. With this knowledge, it's not only much harder, but in fact, in certain respects, the task of Russian propaganda is virtually impossible. Well, I was a resident of Moscow. It was my home for 6 years from 1976 to 1982, really at the height of the Soviet Union's world power under Brezhnev. I went back there in 92, 93 for a year and lived in Moscow when the new era, the era of reform, was getting underway, and traveled periodically to Russia, spending long periods of time during all the years when the criminal state was being constructed under Yeltsin, and then finally when it was confirmed under Putin. The condition, first, to understand the apartment bombings, you first have to understand what happened in Russia. And it reflects the philosophical failure of the West to understand the essence of communism. Because the essence of communism was really class values. The communists rejected the idea of a universal standard of right and wrong. That applied a standard of right and wrong which is transcendent and applies equally to everyone. In its place, they established a system of class values. This was explained most famously by Lenin in his speech to the Komsomol in 1919, or I think it was 1920 actually, in which he said that, people accuse us communists of being immoral. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are actually supporters and propagators of the highest morality, class morality. Our morality is a morality that works for the good of society and the benefit of the working class. Our morality is a weapon in the hands of the working class, and anything which advances the interests of the working class in our worldview is right. Anything that impedes it is wrong. Well, we know the consequences, of course. This meant that anything that the Communist Party, acting for the working class, anything that it did was right. The bureaucracy of the Communist Party were, acting on behalf of the Communist Party, anything that it did was right. And finally, the Politburo, acting on behalf of the bureaucracy, anything that it did was right. And ultimately, one man acting on behalf of the Politburo was the sole determinant of what was right. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, this system of anti-morality was exemplified, for example, as many of you know, many of you are familiar with the figure of Pavlik Morozov. There's ambiguity about what really happened, but officially, he was the son of a kulak, a wealthy peasant, and he informed the authority that his father was hiding grain, and then his relatives, the father's relatives, killed him, and he became a communist martyr. So this was a complete reversal of morality, but in fact it was perfectly consistent with Lenin's concept that anything that's in the interest of the working class as it's interpreted by the infallible Communist Party is right. And since the agricultural policies and the collectivization and the confiscation of grain was imposed by the Communist Party, it was higher than any morality such as loyalty to your own father. Well, you can imagine the effect on an entire society of 70 years of this type of morality. It wasn't just a question that the country itself in its internal and external behavior was out of control. It had a horrific effect on the psyche of millions of people who grew up under these conditions. There was, after the Soviet Union fell, there was a study of this mental health of Russian people, which concluded that 1/5 of Russians suffered from some type of mental problem. Frankly, on the basis of, no offense to anyone, but on the basis of my experience, that was an underestimate. And but in any case, what had to happen after the fall of the Soviet Union was that the class morality had to be rejected totally. And it had to be replaced by a universal morality as expressed in the rule of law. And that didn't take place. The first priority of the so-called young reformers was to transform the economic system irrespective of law and irrespective of ethics. And the result in Russia was the creation of a system that we know by the name of bandit capitalism. So the criminalization of the country not only impoverished the country, but it created a structure of wealth that was illegitimate because it was based on theft. That exists to this day. Those who were able to appropriate the assets that were created by the combined efforts of the entire population were not really interested in developing those assets, at least not at first. And the country was plunged into poverty that was so extreme that the national product declined by a rate greater than occurred even under Nazi occupation. Various estimates put it at 50%. The population, 50. Various estimates say that the population, well, for one thing we don't have to rely on estimates for is the mortality rate. The mortality rate in Russia skyrocketed. Russia became the country with the highest death rate of any country that was not at war. The only places that came close were Somalia, where a civil war was going on, and one other African country, which his name I don't remember. But in any case, what was it? Was it Ethiopia? Yeah, that's it. Yeah, but no industrial country had a death rate like that. The death rate was so exceeded the rate of birth that Western demographers, when they saw the figures, could not believe what they were seeing. It was an almost vertical rise in the death rate. It was reflected a little bit in a case that I've described to various people about a gravedigger in Moscow who was interviewed by Novaya Gazeta. They began creating entire new plots of land for fresh graves, and a gravedigger was interviewed by a correspondent whom I know for Novaya Gazeta, and he said, "You see all these graves? These are all young men. We never had that before," and it was basically a national catastrophe. And that's why many people to this day, when they talk about the 90s and people romanticize that period under Yeltsin, they say, well, you don't know how many people didn't survive the 90s. Partially, it was a result of a phenomenal rise in murders and disappearances, but also suicides, accidents, and the fact that people just broke down because they couldn't adapt to the change from one way of life to another, especially when the new way of life was dominated by criminals. The sociologists and demographers who studied the whole phenomenon came to the conclusion that the excess mortality, now excess mortality is a demographic term which is used to describe the number of deaths that occurred that could not have been anticipated on the basis of pre-existing trends. What a demographer does in 1992, for example, they take the existing trends And they said, well, in 1999, Russia or any other country will have a population of X based on what we see. And any time that figure falls below that, it's almost always attributable to excess mortality. In Russia, the figure was 6 million. So under those circumstances, in 1999, there was very little chance that Yeltsin or anyone supported by Yeltsin could be elected president of Russia. Yeltsin's constitutional 2 terms were coming to an end, and rumors swept Moscow, and I was there at the time, that something big was going to happen. Nobody knew exactly what it would be, but it was assumed there was going to be some type of major provocation that would allow Yeltsin or someone close to Yeltsin to hold on to power. Now, my friend Yevgeny Sevastyanov, who some of you know, or have heard, at least have heard of, who was the, what? Oh, I have to call him, because he just wrote to me to congratulate me on Thanksgiving. So I will congratulate him on being a foreign agent. But he was in a meeting of people. He at that time was the head of the FSB in Moscow. And he was in a meeting with people who were on Yeltsin's staff and discussing the upcoming elections. And there was universal agreement that there was no possibility of winning the election through normal means. And one person, Alexander Oslund, who was Yeltsin's principal poll taker and sociologist, then made a remark. He said, well, what if we win it through non-normal means? And of course, Yevgeny being an experienced person, you don't have to explain to him what they meant by non-normal means. And in fact, word was leaking out in Moscow. Informed people knew that something was being planned, but no one was sure exactly what. Some people said it would be a war between criminal gangs on the streets of Moscow that would be used as an excuse to impose martial law. Another version was that it was going to be a kidnapping of some of the most popular entertainment figures in Russia, and they would be publicly tortured or killed in order to shock public opinion. Other people said, well, would there be someone will blow up government buildings? And these rumors circulated until on August 30th, there was an explosion in the Manege shopping center right in the center of Moscow. One person was killed. Now that, by the standards of FSB provocations, was a pretty inconspicuous terrorist act, but it was a sign that they were testing public opinion. They wanted to see how it was just before the real series of bombings began. They first wanted to see how people reacted, and whatever information they gained convinced them to go ahead. Then the bombings began first in Dagestan and then in Moscow. And by the time the series of bombings had reached Volgodonsk on September 17th, there were by that time 4 bombings. The entire country was terrorized. Yeltsin ordered that 90,000 apartment buildings in Moscow be inspected. People were afraid to go to sleep in their own, because the buildings were blown up in the middle of the night, and people were killed in their beds. They woke up, they went to sleep and didn't wake up, buried under the rubble. And these bombings took place in working class areas. So they appeared to be an attack on the whole country, not an attack on a specific government organization, not an attack on the wealthy, but on the ordinary Russian people. And it was at that time that Putin, who had just been elected not just been selected, excuse me, as prime minister, and had a popularity rating of 2%, as did Yeltsin. Now, 2% in an opinion poll is a negligible result because 6% of the respondents in any poll don't understand the question. So if you have 2%, it's an indication that no one in Russia actually supported Yeltsin or Putin. Suddenly, Putin was everywhere, round the clock on television, vowing bloody revenge against the terrorists who attacked Russian people in their beds and carried out, and were responsible for such a horrible crime. The people who were accused were the Chechens. The mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, said there's a Chechen trace. At the time, nobody understood, what do you mean trace? Is there proof? I mean, has anybody been arrested? Do you have any real idea who was responsible here? But with the population in a state of panic and patrols taking place every night, and a mouse-like prime minister, Vladimir Putin, who had no political experience, who had only served in office as head of the FSB previously, and as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, suddenly emerged as the person in charge of the operation to avenge these horrible terrorist acts. And he, at that point, got on television and said that we're going to destroy the terrorists wherever we find them. He used prison language, said we'll destroy them in their outhouses. And his popularity started to rise. On September 7th, Yeltsin had a conversation with Bill Clinton in which he said, the next president is going to be Vladimir Putin. He's a reliable man. You'll have a good relationship with him. You'll be able to work with him. And it was mysterious. And these conversations have since been published by the Clinton Presidential Library. It was because how could Yeltsin be so sure that he, being the most hated person in the country, could choose his successor, or that Putin, who was a total non-entity and had no public profile at all, would be that successor? But the following day, on September 8th, the apartment building on Guryanova Street was blown up. In any case, the country at this point was primed for revenge and inclined to forget all of the grievances that had piled up during the 1990s, the theft of property, the horrible conditions, the criminality, the corruption, the loss of their savings, the loss of their future. And it was at that point that something went wrong. A fifth bomb was placed in a building in Ryazan, southeast of Moscow, and with the country in a state of panic, a watchful resident noticed the people unloading the sacks and with the high explosives, putting them in the basement. They called the police. Police at first did not want to even go into the basement because it was used as a toilet by local derelicts. But finally, the daughter of this man, whose name was Kartofelnikov, I talked to him later in Ryazan, descended down the steps, and at her insistence, and they came bolting back up out of the basement and said, there's a bomb. It had a detonator, a timer set for 5:30 in the morning. And they called the local police. At first, the local police didn't want to come. No, wait a minute. They called the FSB, which at first didn't want to come, and they did come, and they ordered the complete evacuation of the entire neighborhood. and people spent the night on the streets. Every store shop, but Kartofelnikov and his daughter got a brief look at the people who were bringing these sacks into the building, and they provided enough material for a composite portrait. Those portraits were next to the cash register in every store in Ryazan. The police were put on 24-hour alert. Dmitry Florin, one of the police officers at the time, someone I know, told me it was as if a nuclear bomb had gone off in Ryazan. All exits from the city were closed. The airport was closed. The railroad station was closed. And the perpetrators were caught. And the stolen car that they used was caught. And apprehended, and a telephone operator, before they were captured, listened in on a suspicious phone conversation between people who were saying, "We have to get out of town. They've got everything covered," and were told to leave one by one. And she gave the phone number to the local FSB, which had no idea what was going on, and they called that number, and it turned out to be Central FSB headquarters. And the three bombers presented FSB identification, and they were quickly taken into custody by the Central FSB. So now, the government had to come up with an explanation. Here they had just announced that a terrorist act had been averted and the bombers had been caught. And it turns out the bombers are FSB agents. So Nikolai Patrushev, who was at that time the head of the FSB, took over from Putin. He announced that this was a training exercise. The people in Ryazan were being tested for their vigilance. And in fact, they've even rewarded people. The woman, the telephone operator who reported the suspicious call, was presented with a color television set as a reward. Of course, no one in Ryazan believed that this was a training exercise. And it would not have made sense. Why would you test people for vigilance at a time when the whole country's in a state of hysteria? So, and the U.S. Embassy began receiving reports that this was a provocation from their most trusted sources. And these sources included communists, included people who had either were part of the security services or had good contacts with them. And the U.S. Embassy had access to the reports in Moskovsky Komsomolets, which was the leading investigative newspaper at the time, which showed that this was nothing but a provocation, and that this was under no circumstances a training exercise. But the next day they began bombing Grozny and the war against Chechen began. Obviously the plan was a succession of bombings, with the bombing in Ryazan to be the fifth bombing and the most spectacular, because the building that in whose basement the bomb was placed had 400 residents. It was 12 stories. There was an identical building. It was at the top of a hill. There was an identical building halfway down the side of the hill. Had that bomb gone off, the debris from the first building would have hit the building located lower down on the hill with the force of an avalanche, and there would have been not 400 dead, but 800. But in the end, it wasn't necessary, and that would have been with that, and against that background, they would have begun the saturation bombing of Chechnya, which began anyway. And in fact, it didn't make much difference. The U.S. Embassy was to do everything in its power to cover up what happened, and to say that, for example, that the reports in Moskovsky Komsomolets, and this is in their internal documentation, were typical for a sensationalistic newspaper, ignoring the fact that they had been the most reliable investigative newspaper in the country for much of that period. They simply did not give any credence or attention to the information from their own most trusted sources. And when Madeleine Albright, the American Secretary of State, was asked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, well, who was responsible for the bombing, she refused to answer and said instead that we are opposed to terrorism in all its forms. And basically non-answer. But by doing so, she, more than any other person, helped to bury the truth about what happened. Since that time, I was in Moscow shortly after the bombings. But the timing was, I had sensed before the bombings took place that something was about to happen. And when those bombings took place, I realized it was too convenient. This solved their problem. The predatory class in Russia had stolen so much, billions of dollars worth of property, that they were not going to give it up easily. And if Yeltsin and those around him lost power, that's what they faced, and maybe worse. But and I contacted a friend of mine who was very well placed, and he introduced me to some people from the security services who were by no means happy about the idea of the FSB murdering its own people. And they pointed out that hexagon, the high explosive that was used in the bomb, is produced only in one factory in Perm, which is guarded by the FSB and could not have been transported by amateurs all over the country. That the way in which the bombs were placed were next to the main structural elements of the buildings was the work of professionals. That the timing would not have been possible for anyone except an intelligence organization, and that the choice of targets was deliberate in order to create panic and a mood of aggressivity toward the Chechens. It was not a logical place for a terrorist act. And I then decided to write about this. And this was in October. And I sat down and wrote a piece. And at that time, I got it published in the Washington Times. And it was actually quite a tense moment for me because I was going out to Siberia to write about the criminal situation in Siberia. And I knew that I had a long car ride from a city called Khakassia, which some of you will know, to Krasnoyarsk, 5 hours through, on a lonely road through dense forest, where anybody could disappear. But I decided to send the article saying that the article was entitled Anatomy of a Massacre. And it was the first mention that there was something suspicious about these bombings. And it appeared and was completely ignored. But in the years since then, the evidence has only built up. One incident that took place in the State Duma when Gennady Seleznyov, the Speaker of the Duma, announced that a building had been blown up in Volgodonsk. He made this announcement 3 days before the explosion took place. Now, my good friend Yevgeny Sevastyanov explained to me that there was, in fact, an explosion on that day in Volgodonsk. A grenade had been thrown into the vestibule of a building, and it shattered windows and slightly injured a few passers-by. But what Seleznyov said was that he had been given information that a building had been blown up. So there's a difference between a grenade going off and shattering windows and an entire building being blown up. That discrepancy has never been explained. And my explanation for it now is that, in fact, there was information already circulating at some level that which may have been mistakenly provided to Seleznyov, that something was planned for Volgodonsk, which was the fourth building to be blown up. In any case, a composite sketch of the person who rented the basement in the building in Guryanov Street was given to the FSB by the building manager. And the FSB, it was briefly published and then withdrawn. And the FSB came back to him and said, no, that's not the sketch of the person you saw. This is the sketch of the person you saw. And he said, do you understand? And he said, yeah, I understand. And he said he was not a hero and he was not going to argue with them, but it was a false, it had no relationship to the person who he had seen. The person he saw was resembled a KGB agent, or an FSB agent, forgive me, who had worked with Chechen terrorists and was killed shortly afterward in an automobile accident on Cyprus. So the long and short of it is that the evidence for any normal thinking person is overwhelming and incontrovertible. What I've given you is the briefest of summaries, but it's enough, I hope, to show what happened. And it's the part of the puzzle right now that is absolutely essential for the United States to understand and for American public opinion. We now have, I mean, I've been dealing with Russia and Soviet Union for a long time. And I'm inured basically to the stupidity of people in our country who pretend to be experts on Russia and their inability or their unwillingness to understand a mentality which is different from their own. But I haven't never seen anything like what we have now. And therefore, what's going to be critical in the months ahead is American public opinion. And the one thing that, in my view, could move American public opinion is the true story of how Putin came to power. Because what it really means, Putin is very insolent and making these claims about Zelensky being illegitimate, but that the whole Putin era is illegitimate. It's all illegitimate. It's all a lie. And it can be demonstrated. And that could move American public opinion in this situation, regardless of the policy of and put pressure on the administration. If the United States and the West is sufficiently mobilized on behalf of Ukraine, I believe it can win, for the simple reason that people who believe in what they're doing are going to fight better than those who don't, who are being paid. And there are various signs that the Russian morale is beginning to fray. So in January, there's some good news that the BBC is, for the first time, preparing a 7-part podcast on the apartment bombings. And I know because I have a big role in it. I'm hoping that it will be the beginning of a re-examination of this whole history, for the sake of what's going on now. And if it is, and so anything that any of us can do in this respect, I think it would be very, very positive. And I think there's a role here, especially for the Russian immigration. I've told, I know practically everyone who is a major figure in the Russian immigration. I mean, I don't think there's anyone I don't know or haven't met at one time or another. And I've told them this repeatedly, that this is the most valuable thing that the immigration can do, is to explain this basic fact. And as for Russia's historical future, I don't think Russia has a future until without the truth about the apartment bombing. There's no democratic future. And so the stakes are really, really, really high. And we can hope and continue to do our best, but society itself American society in particular, is going to have to wake up. Now, if that may have gone on a bit long, but there's a lot to relate. If any of you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Yeah, please. Oh, right here. Well, here's there's another mic there.
At the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the Soviet system of morality, where kind of depended on more who's doing the crime versus, the sort of universal morality.
Yeah.
And of course, people have lived and died through the Soviet Union. People have lived a longer life than the Soviet Union had, and before that was the Tsarist times. I just wanted to ask if during the Tsarist time, did it take a characteristic more of the Soviet system morality, or did it have a universal sort of Christian morality, and did that get brought back when the Soviet Union finally buckled under its own weight?
Well, that's one of the that's a question that Russians argue about, and not just Russians, but people who follow Russian history and try to understand the continuities. I mean, was the communist regime something different? I think that the communist regime took what had existed de facto but unrecognized under the Tsar and made it explicit and official. The Tsar, the Tsarist regime was officially Christian, but religious and political authority in Russia were so amalgamated that serving the state was treated as a religious duty. And it was that tendency that was carried over even after religion was denied following the Bolshevik seizure of power, because immediately they created a false religion. The need for religion in the souls of people did not disappear. So instead of the Tsar, they had Lenin as a secular saint, and after he died, he was a god, and his prophet was Stalin. And it had its own catechism. Its claim, and it had its own claim on the soul of people. So communism emerged to take the place of religion in Russia, and the Marxist-Leninist ideology was just the new dogma. So just as religion was consecrated the power of the state under the Tsar, well, Marxism-Leninism did it in the case of the Soviet Union, with the exception, of course, that a regime which was under the influence of Christianity was far more restrained in many respects. not in all respects, but in many respects than the Soviet regime. Don?
Yeah, just following up on what the gentleman behind me has said. I think Marxism-Leninism did replace Christianity as the religion of the people, but there was also another issue, and that was the economy. As strong a role as the Tsar played in the economy and focusing wealth within the upper classes, the communists destroyed capitalism, and the entire driving force of entrepreneurship and the private sector was at some point eliminated. And I think that made, because in 1912, prior to World War I, Russia was really just beginning to wind up its industrial revolution into high gear. And that all stopped. That all was put on hold in World War I, and then the devastation of the private sector and what the private sector provides in the smallest village, it impoverishes people to such an extent. And I think Russia would have done a lot better economically without communism, obviously. But I think the economy is something that is being missed in that discussion.
Well, they abolished the free market. I mean, they imposed a planned economy, but that was something that was implicit in Marxism-Leninism. But what was important was not what was fundamental was not the planned economy, although that definitely shaped the life of the society, but the idea that this economy was somehow religiously sanctioned, and the whole system had well, they didn't call it religion, but they had a scientific sanction. So, but the economy that resulted of impoverished people, and it was ideal for keeping people under control. It was also very effective under wartime conditions. It was one of the things that helped the Soviet Union to win. But ultimately, it could only destroy the country economically. And the economy that emerged post-communist in Russia and China is much more efficient
because it went back to capitalism.
Because we went back to operating on rational principles. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to replace the market with central planning, because the market can distribute resources efficiently and without making decisions, without a central authority making decisions.
The point was that there is out in the information sphere in this community, that the communism was simply a follow-on to Tsarism, and the economic dimension and the impoverishment and the sanctioning of the planned economy as a religious element, I think, sometimes missing.
Well, the communists replaced Christianity with Marxism-Leninism, which was atheism, and then they tried to impose that and enforce people to act out an entire fictitious world. And that there were a lot of commonalities. I mean, the Russian people, because of Tsarism, were ready for something like that and were susceptible to it. But it's not the same. And we see the level of the Tsars, I think, in the whatever it was, though, the 19th century and early 20th century, there were maybe 3,000 people put to death most of them, in 1906, 1908, when they were fighting terrorism, the number of death sentences, aside from that was just, maybe 100. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but it was very low. The Red Terror equaled that in the first couple days. So it was Christianity did have a restraining effect on the society, and it did bring a lot of good, even if it was misused in many ways in Russia. Marxism, Leninism doesn't impose any kind of moral limits on people, as the communists well understood. Yeah, please.
You mentioned about 1976, and I remember in those days, Soviet Union helped. I'm from Pakistan. Helped to build the largest industrial complex. It's called Pakistan Steel Mill. And a lot of young Pakistani went to Russia and they got training. And when they returned, they turned totally against Islam. So my question to you is this: that did communism, as a kind of de facto religion, how it exposed Islamic hypocrisy and the Islam as a dark force to keep people behind so did communism serve that as a good purpose by exposing how in Muslim society religion was abused to keep masses behind?
They did this with all religions, not just Islam. They did with Judaism, with Christianity, with Islam, with Buddhism. They all depicted them as dark forces that were keeping people behind, that were sentencing them to poverty. And they ridiculed the idea of salvation in some world to come because they said it conditions people to accept misery in this world. And that, for some people, since many religions do ossify, and since there were reactionary elements in all the religions that existed on the territory of the Soviet Union, it was very easy to depict it this way. And some people found it convincing because they missed the main point, which was that the religions were the guardians of morality and of higher morality. So it's easy. The easiest thing in the world to substitute social goals for fundamental principles, and that's why the Soviet Union could draw on sympathizers, including many who were not stupid, all over the world, and why Russia is so successful with its propaganda, because people are conditioned not to think in terms of ultimate principles. If somebody says, well, politically this is, if it's just a fight between a comparison of capitalism with all of its abuses and socialism, whose abuses are so in effect communism, socialism is the word the Soviets use, communism, whose abuses are hidden, they're much worse than anything that exists under capitalism, but nobody knows about it, then you can make an argument that some naive people will believe. If you begin to talk about, well, what are the fundamental values underpinning the two, a free system and communism, what are the moral assumptions? You wouldn't get that kind of positive response. But very few people are capable of making the argument at that level. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm curious about the claim you made towards the end around going into this history, revealing this history, particularly the apartment bombings, and the effect that might have on particularly the United States kind of political environment and the sort of hostility towards the Putin regime. Because I think, or at least my impression is, there's a lot of people who for a long time have seen Putin as corrupt, have seen Putin as a warmonger and a whole number of different things. And I just wonder why you think this particular, reflecting on this particular moment in history, why that would have an effect that maybe hasn't been had before.
That's a very good question because, and I've been asked that. Lots of regimes are corrupt. The accusation of corruption can be made. It was made against South Vietnam. It was made against Afghanistan. It was made against South Korea when North Korea invaded. Not the situation with corruption in the Western countries like the UK, the US, various others, is not typical of all countries. You have other countries that have been involved in wars and disputes over territory. But what's unique about Russia and what the apartment bombings show better than anything is a completely different concept of what it means to be a human being. It's a conception of the individual not as having inherent worth, but of being simple, raw material for the use of whoever is in power. And that idea of person as raw material, as basically an insensate, non-thinking, unvalued object that is only worthy of being disposed of in the service of the gangsters who run the state, that's something entirely different. And that's what the West is organized to resist. And it contravenes the principles on which the West is based, by the way, as we know, are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. If we're going to celebrate 250 years of the United States in July, and at a very moment when we're abandoning a country facing an anti-colonial, a colonial power which has that kind of evil philosophy, I'm not sure what we're going to have to celebrate. And it's the problem is that because we don't have with the fall of the Soviet Union, the educational level in the United States and elsewhere in the West really collapsed. There's no and the rise of the internet, and God knows what's going to happen with artificial intelligence. When we had something to worry about, a worldwide threat like communism, which challenged values at every level, there was a small group of people who were capable of thinking and of transmitting their understanding to a much larger group. And we don't have that now. And that's why, and if we talk about those who are in power right now in this country, that's manifested in an extreme form. Anybody else?
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on Ben's question because I thought it was fascinating. So when the Soviet Union was collapsing and glasnost became one of the principles of, the government opening up the archives, and, based on what you talked about, it didn't really help because the criminal state still formed and led to Putin's regime. Why would Russians take the truth about the bombings as something transformative, and as a way to just kind of create a new identity? Like, do Russians want the truth?
Good question. I think that in a lot of respects they don't. But the bombings is particularly sensitive because it shows the attitude of the rulers toward the ordinary people. The propaganda that is being used, they're not saying truthfully to the Russian people. We've organized this invasion of Ukraine in order to strengthen our hold and power and make it possible for us to continue to steal forever. They don't say that. They say that that Ukraine is a clenched fist pointed at Russia, and that in self-defense we have to undertake to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. That's what they say. But their credibility is not 100%, even under these conditions. That's the message that's conveyed on state television. But the message of the apartment bombings is that the people who are propagating this idea and waging this war, in fact, have no regard for the people and no regard for the country, but only for themselves. And aspects of Glasnost did make a difference in underpinning and ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet regime. So under proper circumstances, truthful information can matter. What are the proper circumstances? Okay, so if this information had been presented to them at the beginning, when they thought everything would be very easy, hard to say what effect it would have had. But if it came in conjunction with economic collapse and a crisis at the front, where there are scattered reports of Russians refusing orders, in conjunction with other things, it could be very important. Ilya, what are you going to ask me?
Actually, I had two questions, and one is in continuation to this current one. Boris Berezovsky, who once sponsored, the first revelation of what was going on with the bombings, he was mentoring me, saying that, Ilya, what matters in politics is not who was the first to say things, but who was the first to be heard. And at the time, I was saying to him, when he was telling me that I'm going to publish the story, and you were working on this very hard, Sasha Litvinenko, so I said that most likely you would not be heard, but you would expose the information, which then would become like, okay, so it's some radical position. We will have heard this, and people would become dismissive towards this information. And right now, what we know for sure is that people in Russia didn't hear you. They kind of like, you can find this information on the internet, right? And you yourself, you were telling brilliantly the story about Ryazan, where it did happen. But even when you speak right now to people of Ryazan, and you would not get very common answer that yes, it was.
They won't. They will not. They've been told not to.
No.
Yeah, but
being told, it's like it's a limited circle of people. Still, it's not like something that people want to admit. They want to push it back.
Yeah.
And people in the West, they want to push it back. So my first question to you is: do you think there is a possibility that before the regime would start to collapse, there would be a window of opportunity for the truth to be heard?
And this is absolutely what I'm thinking about all the time.
I know.
So you, as always, I met Ilya for the first time when he was member of the Duma, but he was associating with some very doubtful people, some Democrats and liberals and all this. I said, Ilya, this is not going.
Never the liberals. I was always associated with communists. Come on.
No, but anyway. So I knew him for a long time. We know each other. But anyway, no, as far as the window, listen, we don't know, but I'll tell you my personal experience. When I first began speaking about this, people said it's just crazy. What are you talking about, And no one wanted to listen. But gradually, as the behavior of Putin began to confirm that this was possible, more and more people began to accept what I was saying. and I testified before Congress, and that congressional testimony in 2007 was very widely distributed. And one of the people I testified with was my friend Michael McFaul, who later became the American ambassador. And the congressman asked Michael if it was true or not, because they were completely horrified. And he just, he was trying to get a position with Obama at the time, and he didn't, this was the last thing he wanted to talk about, because, so he just sort of filibustered. And then Boris Nemtsov and I tried to speak to him and explain that Putin was dangerous. And the result of our attempts at raising his consciousness was the reset policy, in which he later then became known as the father of the reset. Now he says he doesn't talk about it, that was all wrong, but okay. Should have listened to us when we talked to him. But then little by little, and finally PBS actually did a program about it, and and they interviewed me. It was the first time really a big mainstream publication began, aside from my writing in the Wall Street Journal and National Review, accepted that this is what happened. And now we have the BBC, which will bring this out. So in other words, the awareness has grown, and also on the part of Russian people, you have to remember the example of Radio Liberty. All these years, Radio Liberty seemed to be broadcasting into a void, providing information to a closed country. They didn't really know, were Russians listening? Their broadcasts were jammed. Then suddenly, and people, this was an alternative version of reality that Russians rejected, but they were aware of it. And then suddenly, glasnost began, perestroika began, and everything that Radio Liberty had told them was suddenly accepted as truth. So I think this is the way it is with Russia. The true story of the bombings, it sits in the consciousness of everyone. Everyone knows that, yeah, it is a little funny how he came to power, but it's going to take a push of some sort. And that's the push that, we can give it in cooperation with events, and we have to try to do it. And if it happens, then suddenly everyone will accept it. There'll be a tipping point in which they'll say, no, it's ridiculous, and everyone will say, well, yeah, of course, it was always obvious. Because it always existed somewhere in their subconscious. But it really is, but the statements that come from our administration at present are so depressing that they themselves need this to be exposed to this. There are some people in Congress, by the way, Congressman Joe Wilson, I made a statement and say, in response to the request that Putin be declared an illegitimate ruler because of the results of the 2020 election? When was the election, the presidential election, the last one? 2024, was it? Yeah, was it 20? I forget, yeah. In any case, he said, well, that was obviously falsified. And so Putin is illegitimate. Now, I said, listen, if you say that Putin is illegitimate because he falsified the 2024 elections, you're saying he was legitimate before then. He says he's never been legitimate, ever. Because, carrying out a terrorist act against your own people, hiding that fact in order to manipulate the elections, that's not fair election practice in any country. So anyway, so that's it. I have described all this in my books. If any of you are interested in reading about it in detail, the whole, it's hard in the course of a single hour to go into the whole story about how it happened and what it means. But I continue to think that there is a need to make this the absolute center of our answer to Russian disinformation, and that it can, and I believe it can make a difference. Yes, Ilya.
So the second question that I had,
Yeah.
after your investigation, after your revelations, not so many people followed up with something of their own.
Yeah.
One guy who actually did was a person who right now would be very unlikely to do it. Was Alexander Prokhanov, the hardliner communist, but currently the biggest supporter of the war with Ukraine, the guy who justified this war. It's a very hawkish person. But nevertheless, 10 years ago, he wrote a book which was called Political Consultant.
I thought it was Господин
Политтехнолог.
I saw Господин Hexagon.
Господин Hexagonos, yes. So it was,
I was unaware of a book, Political Consultant.
Is политтехнолог. Политтехнолог, да.
Was it?
So, it was about a collective figure of a political technologist, which was a blend between Belkovsky and Pavlovsky. But that was what was going on in the first decade. It was until Beslan, so it was ending with Beslan, and basically it was the most anti-Putin book that you can imagine. It started from the apartment bombings, where he was totally on your position, was Nordost, and then was Beslan, and was many other things, Kursk, and stuff like this. So, but nevertheless, the version that was relayed by Prokhanov in this book was that it was Putin was selected by this oligarchy, this Yeltsin liberals and whatever, and then FSB was sitting and saying, okay, so we need to support him somehow, and let's create this provocation so that our guy would come to power. But it was like within FSB, like separately, they kind of decided to do it.
Was this Господин Hexagon or consult? Because the second, I have Господин Hexagon that he wrote.
Okay, maybe it's blending. It doesn't matter.
This
Nevertheless, it's
if
him.
you have that, you have to tell me where to find it.
Yeah, I will anyway. I'll send you this book
okay.
because this book is anyway good, very good.
This is the other thing is that on the basis of what I've seen now, then if you get into the question of what was happening inside this ruling group, that we don't have, who said what to whom. We know what Alexander Oslon said in that meeting because Yevgeny Sevastyanov was there. But, as we say in Russia, I wasn't holding a candle. I didn't see what they were saying back and forth but what I think is that the FSB did not have to have any kind of separate strategy about this. That they knew that the ruling oligarchy was in control of the FSB, and by the way, Putin was the head of the
oligarchy over FSB, not FSB over oligarchy.
Yeah, the oligarchy was over the FSB. I mean, Putin was chosen by Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the creature of the oligarchy. He was, the Yeltsin family was in power. And Yeltsin, it's interesting. Yeltsin was asked about this in this, documentary film by Mansky, and he said, "I interviewed 20 people before I chose Putin." And then there's a scene in the film on the night of the election, and Yeltsin's grandson, also named Boris, 4 years old, is asked by there was Dyachenko and Yumashev. By the way, I know Yumashev. I'll tell you about it in a minute. I gave him a ride home back in 1988. If I had known, I would have driven him into a lagoon or something. No, what he said was that they all stood there and said, "Who are you voting for?" And he's eating some cake, a little 4-year-old saying, "Putin." And everybody bursts into applause. So it was, no, this was the oligarchic plot, and they used the FSB. But once, of course, Yeltsin, Dyachenko, Yumashov, they can't blow up a building. They needed specialists for that. Carrying out provocations, that's the job of the FSB, but they do it for the political leadership. So this, I know a lot of people who like to say, this was the FSB plot. I think they're, doing it for their own reason, including Prokhanov.
No, essentially, you're saying a very fundamental thing now, because what you're saying is that security services in Russia are under control of political elites, which to my mind is the opposite.
They were, but now once they had come to power, once they had brought their own person to power with a mass murder like this, and he staffed the entire government with FSB, it became they became the new oligarchy. But that wasn't. It wasn't. And as far as the role of Berezovsky, you and I will talk about that some other time. But no, and I know a lot of popular books like to say that, it was a struggle against the Democrats versus the FSB, and the FSB won. That appeals to the Western mind, but it's not the way it was. But it doesn't matter even. We know who carried. What matters is that the people in charge in Russia carried out those bombings. They bombed their own people, and that and they did it to come to power, and they are still in power. And to strengthen their hold on power, they're carrying out this mass slaughter in Ukraine. That's all you really have to know.
No, still, it's a politically important question about who is making the decision, because one story is when it is Putin who, to be elected, creates a certain plan. Maybe with consultants doesn't matter, but he makes the decision. Let's make this plan happen, and then tells you are to execute on this plan.
Tells Yeltsin what to do. Yeah?
No, it's not Yeltsin. I mean, he's chosen by Yeltsin, but
tells Dyachenko what to do.
Then who is running the political campaign? To be elected. Totally different story when somebody else here, political circles or FSB making their decisions, and then Putin is their hostage, which they are controlling forever. Because that's fundamental difference in understanding the figure of Putin.
Well, first of all, there was an incident. Now we're getting into deep history here for those of you who want to know it. There was a guy in St. Petersburg named Anatoly Sobchak, and he was very corrupt mayor, and he was being investigated for corruption. Putin was his number 2, and his contact with all the criminal organizations in. But what was interesting was that just at the moment when it appeared that Sobchak was going to be arrested, Putin succeeded in organizing his escape, his illegal escape from Russia, because Sobchak had no permission to leave the country. He was under investigation. And he flew to Paris. And that was organized by Putin. And Yeltsin said openly, and he was quoted as saying that this was, of course, an unusual thing that Putin had done, but he showed his loyalty to Sobchak. In the process, of course, he recommended himself to Yeltsin, because someone who would be willing to carry out any assignment. As we know, he then went there were then accusations against people who were in Yeltsin's entourage, including our friend Boris Berezovsky, and investigation. And the investigation was being carried out by the prosecutor, Yuri Skaratov. And Putin organized Skaratov to be filmed naked in a sauna with two prostitutes. And this film was put on national television. And that was used in order to remove Skaratov. So at every stage, Putin is showing his usefulness to those at the top who had everything to fear from a loss of power. And then Putin was selected, as we say, from, if Yeltsin can be believed, from 20 candidates. And he was the fifth prime minister in 1.5 years. So all of this suggests that Putin was carefully selected to carry out the task, the terrorist act that he did carry out, and that the impetus came not from the FSB, they were the blunt instrument, but from the Yeltsin entourage, maybe Yeltsin himself, unfortunately. I've gone through a long period of wondering about Yeltsin's role. So I'll tell you now things I don't tell everybody. Because, Yeltsin was kind of the hero of the anti-communist revolution. I mean, the question I asked myself was, could this have happened without Yeltsin knowing about it? Well, the usual version is, well, he was so drunk and so comatose that he didn't realize what his entourage was doing. Well, that's bad enough because he was president of the country. That's no excuse, but still it's not as bad as him giving the order or signing off on it. But those remarks to Bill Clinton on September 7th, the Mansky film, and the remarks of Sergei Stepashin, who was the prime minister and said that Yeltsin controlled, he said, don't be fooled, Yeltsin makes every major decision. All of this lead me to believe that, in fact, we cannot take Yeltsin's innocence for granted. Not saying there's enough evidence now to accuse Yeltsin, but that would show not only the whole illegitimacy of the Yeltsin regime and the Putin regime, but it would show the pure imbecility of American foreign policy during this period. Now that's something that, of course, for that reason I've been reluctant to even go into it in my various writing, but I mentioned it in this BBC broadcast without dwelling on it, because for many people that's very hard to swallow. Even my friend Yevgeny Sevastyanov argues with me about that, but to some degree, not very energetically. But that's it. That's the whole story. Is there anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a question and a commentary, and the question is actually my understanding that people who are interested in position politics in Russia generally share this idea, and there's nothing new for them, and probably the most well-known message about the explosion of the buildings was Felštinsky's and Litvinenko's book "Blowing Up Russia." Mm-hmm. So, what's your angle? So, how do you what do you think about this book, and what's the difference?
Well, I think the book is good, and and it provided a lot of material that was very useful. There were two things I thought about the book. First of all, it drew very heavily on the same source that I drew on, which is Novaya Gazeta and their investigation. And Litvinenko, being former FSB, he offered some commentary and some background, not necessarily adding to the facts, but he kind of talked about how it would look from the point of view of the KGB. So the book itself, as far as it went, was very good. But it had one big problem. And it was sponsored by Boris Berezovsky, first of all, who is a very odious figure in Russia. And second of all, in my view, is one of the people responsible for the bombings themselves. So here we have Berezovsky planning the bombings and exposing the bombings. And now I understand that Litvinenko was in a position where he was financially dependent on Berezovsky. And in fact, he had probably saved his life at one point. But as I see that what happened, it was Berezovsky was one of the planners of this. And there is no doubt that he organized propaganda for the Second Chechen War. This Sergei Dorenko took orders from Berezovsky, and he was the chief propagandist. So here we have a book that comes out which can easily be discredited as the work of Berezovsky. And so on the one hand, for the Russian public, the impact is, and every time, I talked about it, they say, oh, that's the Berezovsky theory. I said, it's not the Berezovsky theory. My theory is that Berezovsky was part of this. And in fact, so the book had both a positive and a negative result. It was positive in that it raised consciousness about the fact that there was, why was Berezovsky silent for 2 years if he knew all this? But it was bad because, sometimes the FSB and the KGB and the intelligence services, they are not so worried about being exposed by someone whose narrative they can control. And, for them, having the expose coming from Berezovsky was also a way to neutralize the expose. So, it's clear from the book that Felshtinsky at least did not ask Berezovsky serious questions. And he was also quoted as praising Berezovsky. Well, you're being paid, you gotta be, maybe you want to praise others. Yeah. So, what I wrote about this before, if you want to get into all this. I wrote about this before Litvinenko and Felshtinsky. I was the first person to write about it. And I wrote about, but the book that I wrote about it, the first time was Darkness at Dawn, came out a year after their book. But it was not sponsored by Berezovsky. Anyway, so these are the complexities. There are some good things about the book. By the way, in some ways it did good, and it did good things. In some ways it made it harder because it muddied the atmosphere, it muddied the waters. But that's how I see that. And it's best, that the person who talks about this should be someone who's not paid by one of the perpetrators and who has no stake in all this. It reminds me, actually, this is why I got involved with Russia, by the way, when I was very young. I didn't want to deal with either blacks or Jews in this country because I didn't want anyone saying that I had any kind of vested interest in what I was saying. So I chose Russians because I figured nobody can accuse me of having some kind of stake in what happens in Russia, aside from what I actually believe. And And that's where it is. It's the same thing with these bombings. It should be someone who is like John Dunlop, if you know who, if the name, the late John Dunlop, he was my friend. He was a researcher at the Hoover Institution, and he wrote a marvelous book about the apartment bombings and about all of the other terrorist acts. He was really a wonderful, wonderful person. And he, of course, also is completely, he didn't have any stake, and he wasn't paid by anybody. He just did what he thought was true.
Yeah, and the commentary with regards to eventual mass, let's say, spreading the word and the eventual impact of this information in the future. Because specifically in the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war, when thousands of buildings were destroyed and hundreds of thousands casualties, and soldiers used as cannon meat deliberately and
human waves.
So the real challenge is that the Russian society somehow is taught to be like, you know, indifferent, and the whole new information environment where nobody in general, I mean, is really cares about this. Okay, so what? This is general question to anything.
Well,
and this is the real challenge.
They won't care until the moment when the situation becomes difficult for them, and they're looking for answers. And that's part of what we have to do in the West. It can help the West with sanctions, real sanctions. Those sanctions can help crush the Russian economy. I mean, but this is the best weapon we have. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just slightly unrelated, but more related to the war with Ukraine. Putin recently made a statement on national television saying that there will be a new program for Russian women to get paid, more money for babies.
Yeah, of course.
And rumors are spreading that Russia really doesn't have. Ukraine is very expensive, but the real problem is, the people problem. That Russia's population is declining, and Putin really has a problem with families not having enough children. Do you think that that's something that, will maybe break the camel's back, or sort of like, what I'm trying to say is that
they've had this for a long time. That they've been saying that you have to have more children so we can send them out to be killed. They don't say the second part, but I don't think that. In any case, the results of that will be future wars if they have enough people. There's an interesting statistic from the Second World War. Of the class of 1923, which was called up in the draft when the Nazis invaded, only 3% were still alive at the end of the war. And yet, Russia was able to field an army bigger than the German invading army within a year, because they went to the next age cohort, and they want to create raw material for the future. Pretty depressing, actually, that exists, but that's it. Anyone else? Or have we exhausted
Thank you very much.
this situation? Okay, thank you very much.